The lion was dying. Not quickly, the way lions die in nature when the end comes clean and fast. A final breath in the tall grass. A body returning to the earth it came from. This was the other kind of dying, the slow and man-made kind. A dying constructed piece by piece from a length of steel wire, and the indifference of people who had never once thought about what it would feel like to have your leg held by something that would not let go no matter how long you pulled against it. The snare had been set in the drainage corridor at the southern edge of the Serengeti's Icoma buffer zone, where the park's protected boundary blurred into the unfenced community land, and where poachers had been setting wire traps for 3 consecutive seasons because the corridor was narrow and the animals moved through it predictably, and because the patrols in that section had been reduced following a budget allocation dispute between the Tanzania Wildlife Authority and the regional administrative office that had been going on for 14 months and that nobody outside of 2 government offices had ever been informed about. The lion had been in the snare for somewhere between 36 and 48 hours when Samuel Olsen found him. He was a young male, perhaps 4 years old, at the age when lions are beginning to come into their full power, the mane just darkening at the edges, the chest just broadening into the architecture of what he would eventually be. He had been magnificent probably 24 hours ago. He was not magnificent now. He was on his side in the red dust, breathing in the shallow, deliberate rhythm of an animal that has stopped fighting because fighting costs oxygen, and oxygen is the one thing you cannot afford to waste when your body is using everything it has to keep itself alive. His right foreleg was caught mid-shin in a braided wire snare attached to a stake driven into the ground, and the wire had cut through the fur and into the tissue beneath in a wound that had gone from raw to infected in the specific accelerated timeline of the African bush, where every cut is a conversation between the injured and everything in the environment that eats the injured. His eyes were open. He was watching Samuel approach across the dry grass with the amber, patient gaze of an animal that has moved past panic into something quieter and more difficult to name. Not acceptance, exactly. Not surrender. More like the particular stillness of a creature that has run its calculations and arrived at the conclusion that what comes next is not in its own hands, and that the only available choice is to remain present for whatever it turns out to be. Samuel had seen that look before. He had been a wildlife veterinarian and field conservationist in East Africa for 19 years, and he had seen it in elephants and in wild dogs and in hyenas, and once memorably, in a leopard that he had spent 3 hours freeing from a different kind of trap in a different drainage corridor in a different year, and the leopard had looked at him with that same amber patience the whole time and had stood up when Samuel finished and had walked into the bush without looking back, which was what they always did, which was right and good and the only outcome worth working for. He had been in the Icoma corridor doing a routine camera trap survey for the African Wildlife Collective, the conservation organization he had co-founded 12 years ago in partnership with the Tanzania Wildlife Authority and 3 international conservation bodies. He had his field kit. He had his tranquilizer rifle. He had his radio, which was showing 2 bars of signal in the corridor's cellular dead zone, which was not enough to reach the AWC operations center but was technically enough to receive, a distinction that would matter later. He had been tracking the camera positions by GPS when the lion's shape had separated itself from the grass 30 meters to his left, not moving, not alert in the way lions are alert when they sense a human presence, just lying there with the terrible stillness that told him before he was close enough to see the wire that something was wrong. He approached slowly. He spoke in a low, continuous murmur, not words exactly, more a frequency. The sound of a human voice stripped of everything except its most basic message, which was, "I am not here to hurt you." He had practiced this his entire professional life, the calibration between moving too fast and moving too slow, between presence and absence of threat, between the moment when an animal would accept your proximity and the moment when it would use whatever energy it had left to try to remove you from its immediate environment. The lion watched him come. He did not try to rise. He did not growl. He watched with those amber eyes and breathed his shallow breaths and waited. Samuel crouched 5 feet away and looked at the wound. The wire had cut deep. The infection was established but had not yet reached the stage that meant irreversible tissue death. The leg could be saved. The leg could absolutely be saved, but it needed to happen in the next several hours, not the next several days, and it needed to happen now while Samuel was here with his kit and his training and the specific knowledge of exactly what to do. Because if he left to get back up and came back tomorrow, there might not be a leg to save and there might not be a lion to save it on. He went back to his land cruiser. He drew the sedation. He returned to the lion. keeping the same low murmur going the whole time, and administered the dart with the efficiency of 19 years of practice. The lion's breathing deepened. His eyes stayed open, but the quality behind them changed, the amber dimming to something warmer and more distant as the sedation moved through him. Samuel set down his tranquilizer rifle. He opened his field kit. He reached for the wire cutters. That was when he heard the second vehicle. Thomas Robert had been a wildlife law enforcement officer with the Tanzania Wildlife Authority's Anti-Poaching Division for 6 years. He was 44, stocky, with the sunburned neck and permanently narrowed eyes of a man who had spent a decade working outdoors in environments that the sun treated as a personal challenge. He was originally from Pretoria, South Africa, and he had come to Tanzania via a wildlife enforcement consultancy that the TWA had contracted in 2017 to expand its anti-poaching operations in the corridor regions. And he had stayed because the work was real and because the bush was the kind of place that kept a certain kind of person, and he was that kind of person. He was also, in ways that were not visible from the outside and that he had not been asked to examine by anyone in his professional chain of command, a man who operated from a framework of pattern recognition that he trusted completely and that had been built over years of genuine anti-poaching work in which most of the people he had arrested had been black men in the bush with equipment near animals in distress, which was also, precisely and unavoidably, the description of a wildlife veterinarian performing a field rescue. The framework did not make this distinction. The framework said, man in the bush near an animal with a dart rifle and wire cutters. The framework said, snare. The framework said, arrest. He had received the alert through the TWA corridor monitoring system at 6:47 that morning. The system had flagged a vehicle, Samuel's Land Cruiser, entering the Icoma buffer zone via the southern access track, which was not a publicly accessible route and which required an AWC permit or a TWA authorization to use legally. The system had flagged it because the permit database and the field authorization database were on separate servers that had not been synchronized since a software update in November, which meant that Samuel's valid and current AWC corridor access permit was invisible to the monitoring system, which saw only an unauthorized vehicle. Thomas had received the alert. He had not, before driving out, called the AWC Operations Center to verify whether the vehicle was affiliated with a licensed conservation body. He had not run the plate beyond the basic registration query, which returned the vehicle to the African Wildlife Collective but which he had noted and then moved past without drawing the conclusion it contained. He had not called the TWA licensing office to check whether any field operations were authorized in the sector that morning. He had driven to the coordinates. He had crested the low ridge above the drainage corridor and seen, below him, a black man kneeling in the grass next to a sedated lion with a dart rifle behind him and wire cutters in his hands. The framework delivered its verdict in approximately 4 seconds. Thomas drove down the ridge. Samuel heard the vehicle stop behind him. He heard the door. He did not look up because he was in the middle of something delicate. The wire had a secondary loop that had tightened around the initial cinch, and releasing it in the wrong order would cause the wire to contract rather than expand, which would worsen the wound rather than relieve it. And because in 19 years of field work, he had learned that whatever was behind him could wait the 45 seconds it was going to take him to get this right. Step away from the animal. The voice was the voice of someone who was not asking. Samuel had heard that voice before in various configurations, and it told him several things at once. He finished the release sequence on the secondary loop. The wire loosened. He kept his hands where they were, visible at the lion's leg, and turned his head to look over his shoulder. A TWA officer was standing 10 feet behind him with one hand resting on the holster at his hip, and the other holding what appeared to be a radio. He was white 50s with the look of a man who had arrived at a conclusion before he arrived at the location. "I'm Dr. Samuel Olson," Samuel said, in the same even tone he used for the lion. Calm, clear, non-escalating. "I'm a licensed wildlife veterinarian and the co-director of the African Wildlife Collective. This animal is caught in a snare and is sedated for emergency field treatment. My AWC corridor permit is in the vehicle." He paused. "I need 40 more minutes to finish this. Then I'll show you everything you need." "Step away from the animal," Thomas said again, as though Samuel had not spoken. Samuel looked at him for a moment. He assessed the situation the way he assessed animals in distress. not with the emotional register that the situation deserved, but with the clinical precision that the situation required. He saw a man who had already made his decision. He saw a man who would not be argued with in the next 40 seconds and who was not, in his current posture, going to allow Samuel to continue working on the lion no matter what Samuel said. He also saw the lion's leg. The wire was partially released but not fully. If Samuel stepped away now and the lion came out of sedation before the wire was removed, if the sedation wore faster than projected, which it could in a distressed animal with elevated cortisol levels, the lion would wake with the remaining wire still cutting into his tissue and would thrash and re-injure himself, and the intervention would have made things worse rather than better. "Officer," Samuel said, and the word was chosen carefully, an acknowledgement of authority that was also a request for a moment of professional engagement. "The sedation window on this animal is approximately 90 minutes from administration. I administered it 40 minutes ago. If I stop now, there is a meaningful probability that he regains consciousness before the snare is fully removed and he causes further injury to himself. I understand your position. I will cooperate fully with anything you need from me the moment this animal's leg is secure. That will take 30 more minutes. I am asking you for 30 minutes. Thomas walked forward. He was not listening to the 30 minutes argument. He heard it in the sense that the sounds arrived in his ears, but he was not processing it as information that altered his framework because his framework was not in a processing posture. His framework had reached its output. The output was, this man is poaching or interfering with a snared animal for purposes he was not going to allow himself to imagine too specifically until he had the situation controlled. "Stand up," Thomas said. "Hands where I can see them." Samuel looked at the lion's leg. He looked at Thomas. He made the calculation that a man with 19 years of experience and a deep understanding of both wildlife medicine and the specific costs of physical noncompliance with law enforcement in remote areas makes when the calculation is forced upon him. He stood up. He showed his hands. "My credentials and permit documents are in the left pocket of my field vest," he said. "May I?" "Don't reach for anything," Thomas said. "I need you to understand what's happening to that animal," Samuel said. "Turn around," Thomas said. Samuel turned around. The handcuffs went on in the efficient, practiced motion of someone who had done this many times. Samuel noted the tightness. He noted the position. He did not resist and he did not argue further, because arguing further at this particular moment was not going to help the lion, and it was not going to help him, and the only thing that was going to help either of them was getting to the next stage of this situation as quickly and cleanly as possible. He turned his head and looked at the lion on the ground behind him. The sedation was still holding. The leg was partially free. The most critical loop was released. There was still wire around the leg. There was still wound to dress and antibiotic to administer, and the leg needed to be wrapped, and the animal needed to be monitored through the sedation recovery because complications during recovery in snare cases were not rare and some of them were fatal. "Please," Samuel said. And this was the only word in the entire exchange that came from somewhere other than his professional composure. Just that one word. "Please. Please don't leave that animal." Thomas was already walking him toward the Land Cruiser. He was calling it in on his radio. He was doing the administrative steps of an arrest in a remote location, which were specific and numerous and required his attention. He did not look at the lion. Now, before we go further into what happened next, drop in the comments where you are watching from right now. I read every single comment. Let's continue. The AWC Land Cruiser had a dash camera that recorded continuously when the engine was running. The engine had been running since Samuel arrived in the corridor that morning and had not been shut off because in the field, in a situation like this, you left the engine running because you might need to move fast, and the 3 seconds it took to start the engine were 3 seconds you might not have. The dash camera recorded the next 47 minutes. What it recorded would later be reviewed by 3 separate bodies: the Tanzania Wildlife Authority's Internal Review Board, the East African Wildlife Conservancy Standards Commission, and a joint investigation team assembled by the AWC and the TWA after the footage was provided to both organizations, and what all 3 bodies agreed on, in reports that would eventually produce significant changes to TWA field protocol, was this. At the 4:12 mark of the recording, Thomas Robert placed Samuel Olson in handcuffs and walked him to the front of the Land Cruiser, where he secured him to the vehicle's brush guard using a secondary restraint line from his kit. He returned to his own vehicle and began making radio calls. He did not approach the lion. At the 7:33 mark, the lion's breathing pattern changed. The shallow regularity of deep sedation shifted into the slightly more variable pattern that indicates the beginning of the return from unconsciousness, which, in this animal's condition with elevated stress hormones, was happening faster than Samuel had projected it would. At the 11:04 mark, the lion moved. A small movement, a leg, not the injured one, the left rear, a reflexive repositioning that meant nothing in itself except as a data point in the timeline of sedation recovery. Samuel, standing at the front of the Land Cruiser with his wrists bound to the brush guard, saw it. "Officer Robert," he said, loudly and clearly, "the animal is coming out of sedation. The snare is still partially attached. You need to let me finish what I started, or you need to complete the release yourself. I can talk you through it. It will take 15 minutes. If you don't, this lion is going to wake up with wire still on his leg and he is going to hurt himself and he may die, and that will be because we were standing here doing nothing." Thomas was on his radio. He heard Samuel. He looked at the lion, who was still mostly still, who did not look, from Thomas's vantage point at the vehicle, like an animal in immediate crisis. He looked back at his radio. The TWA regional dispatch was asking him to confirm the suspect's identification, and he was trying to do that, and the radio was cutting in and out because they were in a dead zone and the conversation was going in pieces. "Officer Robert," Samuel said again. 15 minutes. That's all." Thomas put his hand up in the gesture that means, "I hear you, wait." Samuel looked at the lion. He looked at his bound wrists. He looked at the distance between where he was standing and where the lion was lying, which was approximately 18 meters, and he thought about 18 meters and bound wrists and a lion coming out of sedation, and he arrived at the conclusion that thinking about it further was not productive and that the next thing that needed to happen now. "Sir," Samuel said, and his voice had changed. Not louder, differently weighted. The weight of a man who has moved from asking to informing. "I need you to listen to me right now. Not in a minute. Right now. That animal is 3 to 4 minutes from partial consciousness. When he gets there, he will feel the wire on his leg and he will react to it, and the way he reacts to it is going to determine whether he lives or dies. I have the tools and the training to prevent that. My hands are behind my back. You need to make a decision." Thomas lowered his radio. He looked at the lion. He looked at Samuel. He looked at the lion again, and this time he actually looked, which was different from glancing, and what he saw was an animal whose breathing he could now, from this distance, see was no longer the deep regular rhythm of full sedation, and the wire on the leg was visible from here, and the wound around the wire was visible from here, and Samuel Olson was a man who had told him the exact same things every 30 seconds for the past 11 minutes and had been right about the timeline every time. Thomas walked to the lion. He stood over him. He looked at the wire. He looked at the partial release that Samuel had completed before the arrest, the secondary loop open, the primary still cinched. He looked at the wound. He did not know how to do what needed to be done. He knew what needed to be done, but he did not have 19 years of field medicine in his hands, and he knew it. He stood there for a moment with that knowledge, and with the other knowledge, the harder one, the one that had been building pressure in the back of his mind since the moment Samuel had said 30 minutes and he had said turn around, which was the knowledge that he had made a mistake and that the mistake was not an administrative one. He walked back to Samuel. He reached for the secondary restraint. "Tell me what to do," Thomas said. Samuel looked at him. "Release my hands," he said. Thomas released the restraint from the brush guard. He looked at the handcuffs. A beat. He reached for the key. The cuffs came off. Samuel's hands came free. He did not say anything. He picked up his field kit from where it had been placed on the hood when Thomas had moved him, and he walked toward the lion, and Thomas walked behind him, and neither of them said anything for the next several seconds because there wasn't time. The lion was at the edge of the sedation when Samuel reached him. The amber eyes were half open again, the depth behind them returning in slow increments, the body beginning to reassemble the signals from its extremities that deep sedation had temporarily suspended. The injured leg had twitched twice in the past 90 seconds, which meant the nerve endings were waking up, which meant the pain was on its way back. And when the pain arrived, it would bring with it the lion's response to pain, which was, as it was for everything that had pain as an option in its survival toolkit, movement and resistance and the attempt to remove the source. Samuel was talking again. The low, continuous murmur. The frequency. the message stripped to its essential content. I am not here to hurt you. He was working the primary cinch with both hands and a deliberate sequential technique that read, from the outside, like something between surgery and conversation, each movement informing the next, nothing wasted, nothing forced. Thomas stood 2 meters back and watched. He was watching Samuel's hands. He was watching the lion's breathing. He was watching the wound. He was watching a man work with the kind of mastery that is quiet because it has nothing to prove and everything to accomplish, and he was standing with the specific discomfort of a man who is being shown, by the quality of someone else's competence, the precise dimensions of his own error. The primary cinch released at the 1907 mark of the dash camera footage. Samuel drew the wire away from the leg with a movement so careful it barely registered as movement, the wire coming free in a slow unwinding that required him to hold the leg steady with his left hand while his right navigated the last loop, and when the wire was clear he held it up for a moment, just held it, not dramatically, not for any audience, just the natural pause of someone who has completed something that needed completing and is registering that it is done. The lion's leg was free. The wound was bad. The tissue around the snare site was raw and infected and would need aggressive treatment. But the leg was free and the bone was intact. Samuel could feel that, and the blood flow was present. He could feel that too. And these things meant that what came after would be difficult but would not be impossible, and not impossible was the whole of what you needed. He cleaned the wound. He debrided it carefully, removing the necrotic tissue around the edges with the focused attention of a man who has done this enough times to know exactly how much to take and exactly where to stop. He applied the antibiotic solution from his kit, packed the wound with sterile dressing, wrapped the leg in the field bandage that would hold until the lion could be assessed by the AWC veterinary team at the Icoma base camp. He administered a second compound, a mild anti-inflammatory that would reduce the swelling during the critical recovery period and help the lion come out of the sedation without the full weight of the tissue inflammation bearing on the wound site. He did all of this in 22 minutes. Thomas watched all of it. When Samuel sat back on his heels and looked at the wrapped leg and at the lion's face and at the breathing, which had deepened again slightly with the anti-inflammatory on board, he was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of something but the presence of it. The quiet of a man who has done what he came to do and is with that, fully, before anything else is required of him. Then the lion moved. Not the reflexive twitch of sedation wearing off. Not the involuntary repositioning of a distressed animal's nervous system coming back online. Something deliberate. Something that, in a fully sedated animal, should not have been possible, and in an animal at this stage of recovery was extraordinary. He lifted his head. He turned it slowly, with the measured heaviness of an animal working against the remaining sedation weight, and he looked directly at Samuel Olson, who was sitting 3 feet from his face in the red dust of the Icoma corridor, and who had been talking to him in a low, continuous murmur for the better part of an hour. He looked at him for a long time. 10 seconds, 15, the amber eyes clear and present and doing something that no field manual and no scientific literature and no number of years of experience with African wildlife had ever fully prepared Samuel for, which was looking at him the way a specific individual looks at another specific individual, not the way an animal assesses a human for threat or food or territory, but the way one being acknowledges another. Then the lion, with a movement that was slow and deliberate and somehow impossibly gentle, lowered his head and placed it against Samuel's knee. Samuel did not move. He stopped breathing for a moment, which was not a choice. He sat in the red dust of the Serengeti with a wild lion's head against his knee and the morning light coming through the acacia trees in long amber columns and the only sound the wind in the grass and the lion's slow, deepening breath, and he sat there with it the way you sit with something you will spend the rest of your life trying to describe to people who were not there. Thomas Robert, standing 2 meters back, watched this happen. He watched a 400-pound wild lion place his head on a man's knee with the deliberate trust of an animal that had made a decision about who this person was and what this person had done and what the appropriate response to that was. He watched Samuel's hand come up, slowly, and rest on the lion's mane. Not gripping, not restraining, just present. And he watched the lion's breathing deepen further into something that was not sedation, and was not sleep but was the closest thing to peace that a wild animal in pain could produce. Thomas stood with his hands at his sides and did not say anything for a long time. He had been in the bush for 6 years. He had seen extraordinary things. He had never seen anything like this. He had also, in 6 years of field work, never stood exactly here, on the wrong side of a decision that was becoming clearer with every passing second, watching the man he had handcuffed save the life he had been too certain to save himself. The AWC Operations Center received Samuel's emergency GPS signal at 8:14 a.m. The signal was the backup system, triggered automatically when the primary radio failed to check in within a set window, and it included his coordinates and a status code that the Ops Center decoded as Field Intervention in Progress, Monitoring Required. The AWC Operations Center Director, a Tanzanian woman named Dr. Asha Kimaro, was at her desk when the signal came in. She pulled up Samuel's file, confirmed his corridor authorization, confirmed his vehicle registration, confirmed his scheduled camera trap survey for that morning, and then called the TWA Regional Coordination Office to flag that one of her senior staff was in the field in the southern Icoma corridor and to confirm that any TWA units in that sector were aware. The TWA Regional Coordination Office put her on hold for 4 minutes and then came back and said that they did in fact have a unit in that sector responding to an unauthorized vehicle alert and that the unit had made contact. Asha said, "With Dr. Olson, our co-director." The coordination officer said, "The unit reported a male subject near a snared animal with a dart rifle. He's been detained." Asha said, very quietly, "Please give me the unit number." She got the unit number. She called Thomas Roberts' radio directly, connected on the third attempt. She said, "Officer Robert, this is Dr. Asha Kimaro, Operations Director of the African Wildlife Collective. The man you have detained is Dr. Samuel Olson, co-founder of this organization and a licensed veterinary professional with current TWA corridor authorization. I need you to tell me what is happening." Thomas, standing in the grass of the Icoma corridor, watching a lion sleep with his head on a man's knee, said, "Ma'am, I need you to send your veterinary team to the southern corridor, grid reference 4-7, Sierra. We have a lion with a significant snare wound that needs a full assessment." Pause on the line. "Is Dr. Olson all right?" Thomas looked at Samuel. Samuel was looking at the lion's wrapped leg, checking the dressing with quiet, methodical attention. He had not said anything to Thomas since the moment the cuffs had come off. He had simply worked. He was still working. "He's all right," Thomas said. "And the lion?" Thomas looked at the lion, the wrapped leg, the breathing, the head on Samuel's knee. "He's going to make it," Thomas said. The AWC veterinary team arrived at 9:47 a.m. They were 3 people in a white Land Cruiser with the AWC logo on the doors. A young Kenyan vet named Dr. James Otieno, a field technician named Grace, and a wildlife biologist named Dr. Fatuma Moshi who had been with the organization since its founding. They came down the ridge into the corridor and stopped their vehicle and got out and took in the scene in the way that people who work with animals take in scenes, which is first the animal and then everything else. The animal. A young male lion, sedated, lying in the grass, with a professionally wrapped field dressing on his right foreleg and the general aspect of an animal that had been cared for. The everything else. Samuel Olson sitting in the dirt beside him, dusty and calm, with the lion's head no longer on his knee because the team's arrival had shifted the dynamic, but with the lion's body still oriented toward him in the particular way that animals orient toward the people they have decided to trust. Thomas Robert standing 6 feet away, not in a posture of authority, just standing, with his hands in a position that was neither aggressive nor entirely relaxed, the posture of a man who is in the middle of something he is still working out. James looked at Samuel. "You okay?" "I'm okay," Samuel said. "The leg is clean and dressed. The primary and secondary loops are fully removed and accounted for." He held up the wire, which he had coiled and bagged as evidence. "No bone involvement that I could feel. The infection is significant but addressable. He's going to need 4 antibiotics at base and a 2-week monitoring protocol before we can assess for permanent tissue damage." James crouched and began his own assessment, running his hands over the wound site with the focused attention of someone checking another professional's work. He looked at the dressing. He looked at the wound edges visible at the sides. He looked at the lion's vital signs, which Grace was now monitoring. "Good call on the anti-inflammatory," he said. "That's going to make a difference." "I know," Samuel said. Fatuma had her camera out. She was photographing the snare wire, the wound, the stake it had been attached to, which Samuel had already removed from the ground. She was building the evidence record for the anti-poaching report that would go to the TWA. She was doing this with the efficiency of someone who understood that the evidence record was what turned field interventions into prosecuted cases, which was how you actually stopped the next snare from being set. Thomas watched all of this. He was watching the team work, and he was watching the way they worked around Samuel, the small professional courtesies and confirmations, the shorthand of people who had done things together enough times that the communication was compact. And he was watching Samuel in the middle of it, this man he had put in handcuffs 3 hours ago, and he was constructing something he had not started the morning with, which was an accurate picture of what he had done. "Dr. Olson," Thomas said. Samuel looked up. "I need to speak with you." Samuel looked at him for a moment. Then he stood up, brushing the red dust from his field trousers, and walked to where Thomas was standing. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was organizing something. "I made an error this morning," he said. "Not a procedural error. I made the wrong call. I should have verified your authorization before I approached you. I should have listened when you explained the situation. I should have—" He stopped, started again. "I saw what I expected to see," he said, "and I acted on what I expected to see instead of on what was actually there. And that cost that animal 2 hours that he couldn't afford." He looked at Samuel steadily. "That is not the officer I intend to be. I'm sorry." Samuel looked at him for a long time. The amber patience of a man who has a great deal of experience with this particular kind of apology and who is making a determination about what this particular instance of it actually is. "Have you made stops like this before?" Samuel said. Thomas was quiet. "Yes." "Has anyone been harmed?" "Not physically," Thomas said. "Not that I'm aware of." "Not that you're aware of," Samuel repeated. "Not aggressively. Just precisely. The harm in what happened this morning was not just to the lion," he said. "The harm was also that a man who was doing everything right was treated as though he was doing everything wrong. And the only reason that happened is that the picture in your head when you drove over that ridge was already complete before you arrived." He paused. "I understand how that picture gets built. I've been in this bush for 19 years and I've seen how it works. I also know that the picture costs things. Today it cost a lion 2 hours and a wound that's going to take 3 weeks to heal instead of 1. He looked at Thomas. "Tomorrow it costs something different. Or someone different." Thomas said nothing for a moment. "You're right," he said. "All of it." Samuel nodded once. "Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who has heard what he needed to hear and who is deciding what comes next on the basis of what was said rather than on the basis of what would be easy." "The snare operator needs to be found," Samuel said. "This is the 4th wire I've pulled out of this corridor in 3 months. Whoever is setting them knows the patrol pattern and knows the drainage layout. That's inside knowledge." Thomas looked at the bagged wire. He looked at the stake. He looked at the corridor stretching south in the direction of the buffer zone boundary. He was back in his professional mode, which was the mode he was good at, the mode where the framework was correct and the information was complete and the output was useful. "I want a copy of your camera trap data from this sector," he said. "All of it. The last 6 months. You'll have it by end of day," Samuel said. "And I want to know where the other 3 snares were found. Exact coordinates. I'll send you the field reports." Thomas nodded. He looked at the lion, who was now in the middle of James and Grace's assessment, and who was bearing it with the resigned tolerance of a patient who has decided that the people leaning over him are probably not going to make things worse. "What's his name?" Thomas said. Samuel looked at him, slightly surprised. "We don't name them," he said. "We track them by ID number. That one's M47. Thomas looked at him. "M47, he said. "We've been monitoring him for 2 years, Samuel said. "He's a solo male, no pride affiliation yet. He was starting to establish a territory in this sector." He paused. "He's a good lion. He was going to be something." "He's still going to be something," Thomas said. Samuel looked at him. "Yes," he said, with a certainty that was not hope but knowledge. the specific knowledge of a man who had seen the wrapped leg and the clear eyes and the vital signs and knew what they meant. He is. M47 was transported to the AWC base camp at Icoma in a purpose-built transport crate in the AWC Land Cruiser, sedated for the journey and monitored by Grace throughout. Samuel rode with him. Thomas followed in his own vehicle. At base camp, the lion was moved to the quarantine enclosure that the AWC maintained for injured wildlife awaiting treatment or recovery, a large, grass-floored space enclosed by heavy mesh and shaded by an acacia grove. Not a cage in the small and institutional sense, but a contained version of the environment the lion knew. James and the camp's senior veterinary nurse spent 90 minutes doing a full assessment, 4-line placement, antibiotic administration, and secondary wound dressing under proper clinical conditions. The lion tolerated all of it with the patient amber resignation that Samuel had come to think of as this animal's particular character. Samuel wrote his incident report in the camp office. It was thorough and factual, as his reports always were, and it included the full timeline of the morning, including Thomas Roberts' arrival, the detention, the handcuffing, the release, and the completion of the field intervention. It included the dash camera footage reference. It included his documentation of the snare and the stake. He sent it to Asha at the Op Center. He sent a copy to the TWA Regional Director, Dr. Martin Sange, with a note attached that said, "I would like to speak with you and Officer Robert at your earliest convenience regarding both this morning's incident and the broader pattern of snare activity in the Icoma Southern Corridor." Asha called him while he was still at his desk. "Are you sure you're all right?" she said, which was the second time she had asked and the first time she expected a genuine answer. "I'm all right," Samuel said. "I'm tired. And I'm thinking about the other times." "The other times someone tried to stop you from doing this?" "The other times the picture was built before the person arrived," Samuel said. "The other times the wrong framework did the work that thought should have done." He looked out the office window at the quarantine enclosure where M47 was lying with the quiet dignity of an animal in the early stages of recovery, the wrapped leg extended, the eyes half open in the specific way that meant he was processing his new environment and finding it provisionally acceptable. "I'm thinking about the people who don't have 19 years of credentials and a dash camera and an organization behind them. I'm thinking about what happens to them." Asha was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" "I want to meet with Martin Sange," Samuel said. "And I want Thomas Robert in the room." The meeting with TWA Regional Director Martin Sange happened 2 days later, on a Friday morning at the TWA Regional Office in Mugumu, a low building of painted concrete and corrugated iron that smelled of government paperwork and the specific brand of institutional coffee that all government offices in all countries appear to serve regardless of the local coffee's quality, which in Tanzania was remarkable. A fact that made the institutional coffee's mediocrity a particular small tragedy. Sange was 56, a Tanzanian career wildlife official who had been in his position for 8 years, and who had the look of a man who had seen a great many things in the bush and in the office and had developed the scar tissue to deal with both. He had read Samuel's incident report. He had reviewed the dash camera footage. He had had a separate meeting with Thomas Robert on Thursday morning that had lasted 2 hours and that Thomas had come out of looking, by Thomas's own account to his supervisor in Pretoria, like a man who had been thoroughly and fairly held to account and who had no argument with the holding. The three of them sat around a conference table that was slightly too small for the subject matter, and Samuel laid out what he had laid out for Sange in the written report, the timeline, the intervention, the arrest, the release, the lion's recovery, which was progressing well. The infection was responding to the antibiotics, the tissue around the wound was pinking rather than graying, which was the difference between recovery and the other thing. Then he laid out the other part. "In 19 years of field work in this region," Samuel said, "I have been stopped, questioned, detained, or had my credentials challenged by law enforcement officers 11 times. Of those 11 times, 9 involved situations where I was actively engaged in licensed field work with visible AWC equipment and vehicles. Of those 9, 7 were resolved quickly when my credentials were accepted. 2 were not resolved quickly and required external verification." He looked at Sange. "I have colleagues who have had more incidents than I have. I know a field biologist in the Tarangire sector who was detained for 6 hours while a poaching operation happened 3 kilometers away because the officer who detained him didn't accept his credentials and the verification process took that long. He paused. The framework that produces these outcomes is a problem. It is not an individual problem. It is a systems problem. Thomas made an individual error on Tuesday morning, and I accept his apology for that error. The systems problem is what I want to talk about now. Sange looked at him. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he looked back at Samuel. Tell me what you want, he said. What Samuel wanted was specific, and he had prepared it the way he prepared everything, in a document that laid out each element with its rationale and its operational requirements. He wanted a revised field verification protocol for TWA officers that required a minimum verification check against the AWC, the African Wildlife Foundation, and the WCS licensing databases before physical intervention in any situation involving a person associated with a licensed conservation vehicle. The check would take less than 2 minutes with a functioning radio and would have, on Tuesday morning, changed everything. He wanted the verification to be a mandatory step, not a discretionary one, and he wanted it documented in the TWA Field Protocol Handbook with a compliance review built into the officer evaluation process. He also wanted a joint training program. He had designed it with ASHA. 2 days, run twice a year, bringing TWA officers and AWC field staff into the same room to learn each other's work, to understand each other's protocols, to develop the kind of mutual recognition that meant the next officer to crest a ridge above a drainage corridor and see a man with a dart rifle would know that the picture in their head needed to include the possibility that what they were seeing was exactly what it appeared to be. Someone trying to save an animal's life. That training program, Samuel said, should have happened before Tuesday. I am here because Tuesday happened and the lion survived. I am asking you to make sure the next person in my position doesn't need their lion to survive first. Sange read the document. He read it carefully in the way of a bureaucrat who knows when a document is good and who also knows that knowing it's good and getting it done are two different problems. He read it and he set it down and he said, I'll have the verification protocol in the field handbook by the end of the month. The training program will take longer to fund and schedule. He looked at Samuel. 3 months. 3 months, Samuel said. Sange looked at Thomas. You'll co-facilitate the training. Thomas looked at Samuel. If Dr. Olson is agreeable. Samuel was quiet for a moment. I'm agreeable, he said, on the condition that the training includes a full review of the incident this week. Not sanitized. The footage, the timeline, everything. I want officers to see what it looks like when the framework does the work that thought should do. I want them to see the lion in the snare and the man kneeling next to it and the arrest that didn't have to happen. I want the image to be in the room. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Agreed, he said. Then we have an agreement, Sange said. M47 was released back into the Icoma sector 17 days after his rescue. The release was not an event in the staged, ceremonial sense. It was a practical matter, a crate being opened in the drainage corridor at dawn, the animal inside it taking a moment to process the changed information of space and air and the smell of grass, and then walking out. Samuel was there. James was there. Grace was there. Fatuma was there with her camera. Thomas Robert was there. He had asked to be and Samuel had said yes. The crate door opened. M47 stood in the entrance for approximately 20 seconds, which is a very long time to stand in an open doorway when you are a lion and the world is waiting. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the acacia trees. He turned his head and looked at the group of people standing 30 meters back, and his gaze moved across them in the way a lion's gaze moves across the things it has assessed and assigned to their appropriate categories. It stopped on Samuel. It held there for a moment, 3 seconds, for the amber eyes finding what they were looking for and resting in it. Then M47 walked out of the crate. He walked into the grass of the Icoma corridor. He walked south toward the boundary of his territory, the wrapped leg. The bandage had been removed 4 days ago, the wound closing cleanly, carrying him with only the slightest, barely perceptible favoring that would probably be gone entirely in 2 weeks. He did not look back. They never looked back. That was not the point. The point was the walking, the returning, the animal going back to the place it belonged and being able to go there because someone had made the decision to fight for its going. Samuel watched him until the grass closed behind him and the corridor was quiet again with only the wind and the morning birds and the particular smell of the Serengeti at first light, which was the smell of a world that was older than every mistake that had ever been made in it, and that would endure past every mistake that had not yet been made. Thomas came to stand beside him. They stood in the corridor for a moment looking at the grass where M47 had been. "He's going to be fine," Samuel said. "I know," Thomas said. A pause. The wind moved through the acacia trees. "The training program," Thomas said. "I've been thinking about the opening session. What you said about the image being in the room." He paused. "I want to be the one who presents the footage from Tuesday, not to contextualize it or explain it, just to show it." Samuel looked at him. "That's the right call," he said. "I know," Thomas said. "I also know it doesn't fix Tuesday." "No," Samuel said. "It doesn't fix Tuesday, but it makes Wednesday less likely." He paused. "And the Wednesday after that?" Thomas nodded. He looked at the corridor. The grass was waving slowly in the morning wind. The same grass it had always been, the same corridor, the same light. But the morning felt different from the one 6 days ago when he had crested the ridge and seen a man kneeling in the grass and had let the picture in his head make the decision his mind should have made. "There's something I want to ask you," Thomas said. "And you can tell me it's none of my business." Samuel waited. "Why 19 years? In the bush, in the field, doing this work?" Thomas paused. "It's not easy work. It doesn't pay what your credentials could get you. You could be in a university or a hospital or a—" He stopped. "Why this?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the grass where M47 had disappeared. He looked at the acacia trees and the morning sky and the particular quality of light that the Serengeti produces in the first hour after dawn, a light that had no equivalent anywhere else he had ever been, a light that came from the combination of the altitude and the dust and the angle of the sun, and was the light of a world that predated human presence by a very long time and that would, if given the chance, postdate it. "Because they were here first," he said. "Because every one of them that disappears is a loss that cannot be replaced. Because the bush is the only place in the world where you can stand still and feel the actual scale of what we're a part of." He paused. "And because someone has to show up." He looked at Thomas. "Someone has to be in the corridor when the lion is in the snare. If I'm not there, he dies. It's very simple. I want to be the person who's there." Thomas said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the ridge. He was thinking about the moment he had crested it and seen what he'd seen and had driven down with his framework already at its output. He was thinking about what the corridor would have held at 7 a.m. on Tuesday if Samuel had not been there. A lion in a snare, dying, alone, with no one coming. "I want to be better at my job," Thomas said. Not to Samuel exactly. Not to anyone. Just to the corridor, to the morning, to the grass that was waving in the wind. "I want to be actually good at it. Not just at the arrests." "Then you will be," Samuel said. "You're already asking the right questions." He picked up his field kit from the ground and settled it over his shoulder. "Come on. Asha wants a full debrief at base camp before noon, and she is not a person who accepts late reports." Thomas picked up his own kit. "How long have you known her?" 12 years. She was my first field hire." Samuel began walking toward the vehicles. "She is smarter than both of us and she knows it and she's never once needed to say so." Thomas fell into step beside him. They walked through the morning grass of the Icoma corridor, two men going in the same direction, which was not a thing that had been true 6 days ago and was true now because of a lion in a snare and a dash camera and a phone call and an apology that had been real and a request that had been reasonable and a decision to be better that was still being made, one morning at a time, in the complicated and necessary and irreplaceable work of being present in the world for something other than yourself. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning, the first joint training session of the TWAWC Field Recognition and Collaboration Program opened in a conference room in Mugumu with 14 TWA officers and 11 AWC field staff in attendance. Thomas Roberts stood at the front of the room with a laptop and a projector. He looked at the room for a moment before he started. 14 officers who looked the way he had looked 6 months ago. AWC staff who looked the way Samuel had looked in the corridor. The particular patience of people who have been in the field long enough to know that patience is not optional. He pressed play on the dash camera footage. The room watched. They watched the land cruiser arrive in the corridor. They watched Samuel approach the lion. They watched Thomas's own patrol vehicle come down the ridge. They watched the arrest. They watched Samuel stand with his hands bound to the brush guard and talk about the sedation window and the snare wire and the timeline, and they watched Thomas on the radio not listening, and they watched the lion's leg twitch, and they watched Thomas remove the handcuffs. They watched Samuel work. They watched the lion lift his head. Thomas let the footage run to the end. Then he turned off the projector and looked at the room. "I made every mistake that you have been brought here to learn not to make," he said. "All of them, in sequence. I had a framework and I trusted it without testing it, and I acted on the output before I verified the input. And it cost a lion 2 hours he couldn't afford, and it cost a man his dignity for the duration of a morning, and it could have cost significantly more than that." He paused. "I am going to be working with Dr. Olson to build the verification protocols and the collaboration tools that this program is centered on. I am also going to be doing something simpler than that. I am going to be asking, every time I approach a situation in the field, whether the picture in my head is complete or whether I have assembled it before the evidence was in." He looked at the room. "That question should have been in my head before I drove down that ridge. It is in my head now. That is what this program is for." Samuel was sitting in the third row. He was listening. He was also, because 19 years in the field had wired certain habits into him permanently, watching the room to see how it was receiving what Thomas was saying. The room was receiving it the way rooms receive things that are true. Not with comfort, exactly, but with the quiet, slightly uncomfortable attention of people who are recognizing something about themselves in what is being said to them. Some of them were looking at the blank wall where the footage had played. Some of them were looking at Thomas. A young TWA officer in the second row, a woman who couldn't have been more than 26, was looking at her notepad and writing something, and Samuel could not see what she was writing, but the speed and focus of it told him something. After the session, she came up to him in the corridor outside. Her name tag said Naomi. She said, "Dr. Olson, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead," Samuel said. "How do you build the framework? The correct one? The one that doesn't already know what it's going to find?" She looked at him. "How do you train yourself out of the wrong one and into the right one?" Samuel considered her. "By going to the place," he said. "Not the idea of the place, the actual place. By sitting in the corridor until the corridor teaches you what it is. By spending enough time with the thing that you stop projecting what you expect and start seeing what's there." He paused. "It takes time, and it takes being willing to be wrong about what you thought was there." He looked at her. "You're already ahead of where I was at your age just by asking the question." Naomi looked at her notepad. "I've made stops," she said, "that I'm not sure about. I was sure at the time." "I know," Samuel said. "Write them down. Think about them. Bring them to the next session." He paused. "That's what the room is for." M47 was sighted 11 days after his release by the AWC camera trap at grid position 4-9 Sierra, which was within his established pre-capture territory. He was walking through the corridor in the early morning light, the injured leg bearing his weight fully, no favoring visible. His mane was fuller than it had been. His eyes, in the camera's night vision glow, were amber and calm and completely his own. He was alone, which was right and appropriate and exactly the way it should be, a lion in his territory at dawn, doing what lions do, which is occupying the world with the absolute, unself-conscious authority of a creature that does not know what an apology is and does not need to, that simply goes on being what it is in the place it belongs, continuing as the world requires it to continue. Samuel reviewed the camera trap footage in the AWC office on a Friday afternoon. He was due to fly to Nairobi for a conference on Monday. He had 14 emails to respond to and a funding report to finish. His desk was the desk of a man who was doing more work than one person was meant to do, and who had been doing more work than one person was meant to do for 19 years and who had no intention of stopping. He looked at M47 on the screen. The amber eyes in the dark, the full mane, the leg that had been in a snare 8 weeks ago and was now carrying him through the Serengeti at dawn without a mark to show for it except the one that didn't show, the invisible one, the one that was not about tissue or bone but about having been at the point of dying alone and then not dying, About having been in the worst place and been found there by someone who showed up and did the work and did not look away. Samuel looked at M47 for a long time. Then he saved the image to the folder he kept for the ones that made it. The folder was large. Every image in it was an argument for continuing. He closed the folder. He opened his emails. He had work to do. Outside the office window, the Serengeti did what it had always done, which was to persist in its extraordinary, ancient, indifferent magnificence, the grass waving in the wind of an afternoon that was the same as 1,000 afternoons before it and different from every one, the acacia trees doing their slow, patient work against the sky, the world going on in the way that worlds go on when there are people in them who have decided, against the odds and the budget constraints and the misidentifications and the 11 incidents in 19 years and all the rest of it, that the going on is worth showing up for. It always had been. It always would be.